Hi everybody, it's Courtney, and today I'm using the Shake Your Merry Maker stamp set by Trinity Stamps, and today's theme is scene building. So we're going to talk a little bit about perspective. So I am going to start by drawing a straight line across my panel just slightly above the midway, so a little bit towards the top, and then find the center. That line that goes across is the horizon line, and that little X is going to be the vanishing point. So before I start using that vanishing point, I'm going to draw in my back wall. So I'm just basically drawing straight lines, straight horizontal and vertical lines to create my back wall, just making sure it's even on both sides. Then I'm going to start using this vanishing point to create my perspective. Now, all the lines that I draw, the end is going to be lined up with that vanishing point. So I'm going to line this corner up with that vanishing point and draw in where my wall meets the floor. Same thing for the top. I'm going to use that corner of the back wall and that vanishing point to create where the wall meets the ceiling. Now for the little dance floor that my Santa will be dancing on, I want this to look like a wooden floor. So I'm going to draw little tick lines across the entire back portion of the floor, and I'm going every quarter of an inch. You can do this any way you want, but I'm going to use that vanishing point once again to create these floor planks or wood floor planks, whatever you want to call them. And I'm going to line up each one of those tick marks with my vanishing point and draw my little line there. So as I get towards the center, you're going to notice that the lines become a little bit straighter. They're not so slanted. It's going to look a little wonky at first, but like most things, it's going to look bad before it looks good. So as you can see, I am using a pencil for all of this because after we have all of this done, we have to stamp our images. Now, I already have my images lined up in my MISTI because, believe it or not, this is the second time I've started this card because I failed to press record the first time. So I already have them lined up. I'm going to go ahead and stamp those out with blackout ink by Ink on 3. I did stamp this twice, especially for the Santa's belt. It's already solid and I want this to be nice bold black. So now that my images are stamped, I can go ahead and go over my lines. I'm going to be using an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen. It is discontinued now, but like always, I will link something very similar below. You can always use a Copic multi-liner, but that can get a little pricey. So I'm just going to go over all of the lines that we've already drawn out. And then once my lines are complete, being careful to go around my stamped images, of course, I can go ahead and erase all of the lines that may be poking through all of these areas, as well as that horizon line and the vanishing point. And of course, as always, you want to make sure that all of these lines are erased before you start your coloring. If you do your coloring at first and then try to erase it, you're not going to be able to, you might be able to fade them away, but you'll never completely get rid of them. So for my coloring, I'm going to start out with the walls. I'm starting with the lightest color here just to kind of get my darkest areas mapped out. I want my walls, the ceiling, and all of it to be a very dark blue because this is kind of like a club, I guess, Santa's little dance club. And so I want it to appear to look dark. So I'm pretty much just concentrating my darkest areas where the floor meets, where one wall meets another. And then from the bottom and the top. So probably the furthest away from my little disco ball. So next I can go in with my darkest color and kind of just go over, use those guides that I've already created to add my darkest areas or add my darkest shading. And you can see that I'm working with straight lines here, which is not something I typically do when I'm looking to get a really good blend. I usually like to use some flicking motions, but for this particular color combination, they blend very nicely. And I already have my paper a little bit saturated, so I shouldn't have too much of an issue blending that out. So this is the B99 for my darkest color, and I am going to add this to the very top portion of my card panel as well. And like I said, it's just pretty much going to be a straight line. Then I can move on to the B, B97, and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit further. And I'm pretty much just going over where I left off with the B99 and just extending that out. Once I have that done, I can move on to the B95, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to extend these areas out, starting where I left off with the previous color. And then finally, I will finish off with the B93, which is the one we started with, just to kind of get those areas to be mapped out. And this is where I'm going to fill in the rest of the area. Now for the Santa, you just need to be careful that you're not going over him. In the red areas are what I plan on coloring red. It wouldn't be too big of a deal, but the areas that are going to remain white, you want to be super careful. You will probably have to use a colorless blender to kind of tone it down if you happen to go over that area, which I did, but I am trying to be careful. Now for large areas like this, if you get those streaky lines that you will get with any alcohol marker, not just Copics, you may have to go over certain areas twice to kind of super saturate the paper, and that should get rid of all of the streaky lines that you may have. So next we are going to move on to the floor, and I want this, like I said before, to be a wooden floor. So I'm going to bring out some E markers. I'm going to be using some E50 markers, and once again I'm going to go right in, well, not once again, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color. I'm going to add a little bit of shadow between each one of the wood planks. And you can see that I am adding it to the left-hand side for the ones that are on the left. And then once I get to the ones that are slanted off to the right, I'm going to add my shadow off to the right-hand side. Then I also want to add some shading to the back of the dance floor. The further back an object gets, as long as it's the same object, as you're looking at something, the further back it gets, the darker it will appear. So I'm just going to be adding a little bit of shading where my floor meets that back wall. Next, I can go in with the E57, and I am just going to extend these areas out a little bit further. And you can see that for the shadows between each one of the wood planks, I am just using the tip of the marker. So I don't have a whole lot of area to work with to get all of my shading in there. So I have my marker almost straight up and down in order to just use the point. Now for the back of the floor, I am just extending this area out as well, but you can see that I am not necessarily using flicking motions, but I guess they are kind of flicking motions, and this will allow my colors to blend a little bit easier. Next, for the E55, I'm going to do the same thing, just extending these shadows out and then extending that color out from the back of the floor as well. Now, here is where I am starting to use a little bit more flicking motions just to get those colors to blend. The E57 and 59 blend a lot better than the 57 and the 55. I feel like there should be another one in between there, but there isn't. But I'm going to finish off with the E53 and just fill in the remaining areas. I'm working on just one at a time so that I don't move that darkest color around. Remember that the lighter the color is, the more it will act as a colorless blender. So now we're going to move on to our images. And I did go over that little disco ball a little bit too much with the blue. So I'm going to just use a colorless blender to kind of push that color out where it needs to go. And I'm going to give it a minute before I color that because this ink will stay wet a little bit. And if I color directly over it, it's just going to kind of move around. So I'm going to start with some C markers for the white areas of my Santa outfit as well as his beard. So for the base of his hat and the base of his jacket there is going to be a little bit of shading on either side because these would be more rounder objects. And this image has quite a bit of detail, and I'm just using those flick lines that are part of the illustration to my advantage to add a little bit of texture to these areas as well. Now for his beard, I'm just adding some flick lines underneath his mustache, and for his mustache, I am just adding a little bit of shading where in the middle, where it comes out from underneath his nose. I'm going to blend that area out a little bit with the C3 and the C1. Now, the C1 is very, very light, but there is definitely a transition from that and white paper, and I want to get rid of that harsh line. So I'm going to bring in a C00, which is nearly a colorless blender, and I'm going to add some flick marks from the opposite end. So I'm going to start in the middle of his hat, and I'm going to start on the bottom portion of his beard to get rid of that harsh line, but still maintain that texture. I did forget to color the little cuffs of his jacket, so I did go back in with that same color combination. I also forgot the pom-pom on his hat, but I'll realize that later. So next for the disco ball, I honestly don't know what way I should have shaded this. So I am kind of shading it the same way as I did for the floor. So on one side, I'm shading it to the left, and on the other side, I'm shading it to the right. I'm adding like little L shapes to kind of have a little bit of differentiation between each one of the little mirrors that are part of the disco ball. But I really don't think that there would be a right or wrong way to do this. I did end up bringing in a C7 just to go a little bit darker, just because I felt like I needed more grays in there. I needed more contrast in certain areas. But like I said, maybe there's a right way to color this. Maybe there's not. I kind of just went with it. So I'm going to use the C7, C5, C3, and C1 for the disco ball. Now I am going to move on to Santa's skin tone, and there's not a whole lot of his face showing, so I only used 3 colors. Typically I use 4, but I am going to start with my lightest color to kind of get the paper saturated a little bit, and then go right in with the darkest. Now I'm going to add a little bit of shading underneath his hat, above his nose, and I'm going to put some shading on the base of his actual nose, and then just blend that out with the mid-tone and finish off with that highlight color. For his gloves, I think they're probably supposed to be white gloves, but I had so much white going on that I brought in a green combination. And again, just going to use 3 different colors here. I went right in with my darkest color just to avoid any bleeding. I added a little bit of shading where his jacket would be hanging all over his gloves, and where his, I guess on the palm of his hand, where his thumb is kind of bent in a little bit, that little crease. I'm not sure what it's called, but you guys will probably know. Just leave it in the comments. I know you guys always have to correct me because I never look things up before I start my voiceover. So this is where I realized I forgot the little pom-pom on his hat. So I wanted to make sure I colored that before I went in with my red combination, because once you get reds in places you don't want them to be, it is nearly impossible to get rid of them. So for my reds, I'm going to stick to my usual red combination that I use for pretty much everything. And I am starting with my lightest color to kind of get everything mapped out. Like I said, this image has a lot of detail to it. So I'm just using that to my advantage to kind of know where my shadows should be, or where I should add a little bit of texture. But pretty much I'm just concentrating my shadows being on either side, and where one area is underneath another. So where his beard is hanging over his jacket, that would create a shadow. Next, I can go in with my lightest color, or my darkest color rather, and I'm using this very sparingly. This is what I refer to as a scary dark. If you have never watched my videos before, the scary dark color is basically the color that is scary to use because it's significantly darker than what you want your image to actually be. But this is the color that is going to add all of that contrast, even if you just use a tiny bit of it like I'm doing here. So next I can move on to the mid-tone colors. I am starting with the R46 for my darkest mid-tone, and I'm just extending these areas out. I'm also creating a few more shadows here and there. Not every shadow has to be done with your very darkest color or that scary dark color. You can certainly continue to add shadows that may not be as dark normally with your mid-tone colors. So next is the R24, just going to extend these areas out even further, and you can see that I'm leaving very little room for my highlight color, and that's fine. The highlight should be used sparingly, but again, this is something that is going to add that contrast. So just going to fill in that white area that I have left here, and that then move on to his boots. And I want his boots to be black. So I am going to bring in my black marker and also some grays so that I can get that contrast. So I'm going to start off with the black, and I'm going to kind of add the shape back into his boot. So the top portion of his boot, it looks like it probably is folded over. So I'm kind of just bringing in those lines a little bit so that it looks like it has that shape. I'm going to keep the toe portion of the boot to be the lightest, which would naturally be the lightest anyway. Going to blend that black out with the C7, then the C5, and finish off with the C3 for the highlight color. And every single time I do a voiceover, Macy decides to run around the house like a mad woman, and that's exactly what she's doing now. So if you hear some rustling in the background, that would be Macy running around like a mad woman that she is. So now that my coloring is complete, I needed to add some shimmer to this disco ball. I'm using I think it's called a Stardust gel pen, but I'll link it below. It's basically a clear gel pen with a whole lot of shimmer, much more shimmer than a shimmer pen. And I'm just going to go over the darkest areas that I had added my shading to the disco ball. And this will kind of give the illusion that there's a reflection coming off of it. I also added some white gel pen details to Santa, just adding a little bit of a highlight to the tips of his boots or the toe area, as well as the Santa hat. Now, when I look at pictures of like a dance floor with a disco ball, you can kind of see the reflection and kind of like rays coming from the disco ball. So this is what I wanted to do. And I was terrified to do this because I did all this coloring and now I'm potentially ruining the card. So I'm going to take some Post-it note tape and I'm going to meet the two pieces on the disco ball and I'm kind of creating triangles against the wall of my little nightclub here. Then I'm going to take some white pigment ink. This is Unicorn White Pigment Ink by Hero Arts and a very small blending brush. And I am just going to use this Post-it note tape as my mask and just add a little bit of color, or not color really, ink to the opening there, to my little triangle. Then I can remove my Post-it note tape. I didn't really go close enough with that one, so I wanted to try it again. This time I'm creating the point of my little triangle there a little bit closer, or a little bit right on top. It's not closer, it's right on top of my disco ball. And again, just added a little bit of the ink where my triangle is, I guess you could say. Being careful to remove that Post-it note tape. This is pigment ink, so it does take a little bit of time to dry, but I just continued this all over the place. I went directly over my images because naturally that would be the way it would be anyway if there was a disco ball, and just kind of continued that all around. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it is what it is, and I'm certainly not going to redo the card a third time. So once that is done and dry, because like I said, the pigment ink does take a little bit of time to dry, I can move on to finishing up the card. So I am going to stamp out my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there on the top left-hand corner. And then, of course, add even more shimmer. I added more shimmer to the disco ball with a shimmer pen by Spectrum Noir. I started to add some to the rays that we created, but it's pigment ink and that doesn't work. So don't do that. But that is it. That is the card for today. Today, I'm collaborating with Nancy, who is also doing some scene building on her channel, and I will link that below. As always, thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I will see you again tomorrow. Bye.